Let me go straight into the theme of the debate. In the wake of Weinstein, the Weinstein scandal, many call for a boycott of the films of Polanski and Woody Allen. Yet, 20th century literary critics encourage us to look at the text alone. Are the misdeeds of writers, thinkers, and artists irrelevant to the way we look at their work? Or should we excise the morally indefensible? We have a very interesting and diverse panel this morning. To my right is Stanley Fish, the eminent literary critic and legal scholar. Nell Stevens, who is a memoirist and a Goldsmith lecturer. To my left, I have John Harvey, who is a Cambridge Life Fellow and an expert on visual culture. And to the very left, I have Emma Sulkowicz, who is an activist and performance artist. And I'll let Stanley Fish start.
My first instinct was to say that you cannot separate the artist from the art because I'm an intentionalist and believe that meaningful marks and signs are only meaningful if one assumes that they've been produced or designed by an intentional being. Therefore, the separation of the artist from the artist is, from my point of view, impossible. But then I had a second thought, recalling a colleague who was a terrible person. He was absolutely untrustworthy, malevolent, said and did horrible things behind your back. But when I invited him into my class to explain a technical matter that I would not have been able to explain, he bent himself to the task in a way so pure that you could see, almost see, as he began to talk, that the zeal for his subject burnt away all the malign aspects of his personality. And he was another person. And so it occurred to me that no doubt there were artists like that. And then I recalled that T.S. Eliot, in Tradition and Individual Talent, had indeed defined art and artistry as the extinction of personality, so that the artist, rather than bringing with him and transmuting all of the him or her and transmuting all of the aspects of a personality, instead concentrates and focuses in the way that my colleague did. But then, this is all of but then I remembered Woody Allen. I live part of the year in Manhattan, and as I went around the corner from my apartment last year, there was a Woody Allen movie being made. So Woody Allen is right there. What am I to do with that? And of course, you can't separate Woody Allen from Woody Allen movies, because Woody Allen movies are all about Woody Allen. So much so that distinguished actors and actresses like Michael Caine and others speak in Woody Allen tones when they appear in his movies. So I thought there must be a distinction between authors who perform as my colleague did and burn away all of their moral warts, and artists like Woody Allen who make art out of their moral warts. So therefore it would be a wrong act of critical deportment to ignore that. And then I thought, there's also the distance question. Caravaggio murdered somebody. The great English poet Ben Jonson, as far as we know, murdered 2 people. It might have been more. But when I see a Caravaggio painting or read a Ben Jonson poem, I'm not thinking about that. Apparently, Robert Frost, a great American poet, was also, according to his biographers, one of the vilest people who ever lived, betraying and being cruel to everyone. But when I read The Road Not Taken, I don't think of that. So that led me to another thought. Maybe it's distance. Maybe the museum effect kicks in. And when they're dead or hanging somewhere or part of the Harvard Library of Classics, you don't have to worry about any of this stuff. And then my final thought was that perhaps this question, the question we've been asked here to consider, is in fact misstated, because it assumes the distinct and stable identity of both the artist and the work of art. But in the last 40 years, those assumptions have been exploded by performance artists like Emma, by people who make art out of garbage and then strew it around the floor, by those like Robert Rauschenberg, who makes art by erasing a drawing of de Kooning's, and then says that destruction is in fact the hallmark of art. So perhaps our entire panel is a mistake. But after having raised this question, I find myself at the end of my time, so I won't answer it.
Right. So, well, thank you very much, Stan. But before we leave, I think we will hear what the others have to say.
Oh,
Nell.
oh, it says always those others.
Well, maybe I don't need to comment at this point. I think that was a really interesting introduction to this question. I come to it from a position of studied and passionate ambivalence, which is not to say that I don't care, but rather that I feel myself to be pulled very strongly in two different directions. One is a really personal reaction of rage and outrage about the disgraceful behaviours of so many normally men to people, normally to women. And I think perhaps one thing we should lean on, and Stanley touched on it perhaps, is the relevance of the personal to all of this. This is a personal question to a lot of people, and to most women, it brings up a lot of memories and trauma, and that we can't lose sight of that when we talk about this in an academic tone. The other sort of pull to my attention and opinion is a rejection of absolutes and a real discomfort with, I think, a perceived lack of nuance in the conversation when we talk about boycotting or cutting out certain artists from our canon. So I'm just going to use this time to quickly dig into a few of those potential difficulties or nuances or hypocrisies. The first is to highlight who we are willing to offer to this conversation of whether or not we can separate the art and the artist. It comes back over and over again to Woody Allen. We're very interested in trying to see whether we can possibly separate the art from the artist when the artist happens to be a rich white man. We are far less interested in having that conversation about Juno Diaz, a Dominican-American writer, or Sherman Alexie, a Native American writer. The people who are being punished for this most severely tend not to be the most powerful people, and that is something I think we have to stay aware of when we talk about these things. And the other question I have is what our goal is when we decide we cannot separate the art from the artist. When we talk about boycotts in other situations, other contexts, we tend to have a financial goal. The goal is to harm someone financially by not buying their product. In which case you would think that this conversation would end upon the death of the artist. But if we look at someone like Naipaul, who recently died, his death was really the beginning of a whole lot of conversations about whether or not we can accept him. And that's not going to, if we don't buy a Naipaul book, it no longer harms a dead man. So what we're looking at actually is a cleansing of the canon. And then we come back to this question that Stanley has raised about distance. Staying on Naipaul, the parallels in the behaviours between Naipaul and Charles Dickens are extraordinary. Dickens was a passionate racist. He called for the extermination of the Indian race. He was a vile misogynist who treated women in his life absolutely appallingly. And yet we think of him as very cozy. We cling to this avuncular image of Dickens, who created Christmas as we know it, and all of these things. And again, is this really just a question of whiteness and power and masculinity? Emily Bronte in The Guardian recently was told we shouldn't be reading Wuthering Heights because she was a difficult woman, and if she'd been alive today, she would have been a Tory. So who are we punishing when we enforce these kinds of absolutes? And is there a chance that we can open up the canon in a more interesting way when we choose to obliterate certain people from it?
Good. Thank you very much. Then we have now more questions again, so we do have something to debate. I will give the word then to John.
Thank you. We ban from our television entertainers who abuse children. Child abuse is vile and a crime. Of course, murder is also a crime, and Caravaggio murdered someone, and Ben Jonson may have murdered someone, but they weren't career murderers, whereas John Ruskin, one would have to say, was a lifelong paedophile. This is something I got to know more about when I wrote a novel about John Ruskin, his wife, and her lover, the subject of a portrait, where I came up against Ruskin what he called his terrible weakness. He said, I am very naughty about tinies, that's little girls, and I've less and less hope of mending.